She had nothing. No money, no name worth keeping, no place on this earth that wanted her back. Evelyn Hart stepped off a broken-down stagecoach into a town that smelled like mud and failure, carrying everything she owned in a single carpetbag with a busted clasp. She'd been robbed blind by a man who promised her a husband and a new life out west. Instead, he took every cent and disappeared like smoke. Now she stood in Black Hollow, a town so far gone even the vultures had moved on, and heard the locals whisper about a scarred man in the mountains who once beat someone half to death with his bare hands. Most people would have run. Evelyn walked straight toward him. If you want to find out what happens when a woman with absolutely nothing meets the most dangerous man in the territory, stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Bye. The stagecoach left her standing in a cloud of yellow dust that settled on her shoes, her skirt, the inside of her throat. Evelyn coughed into the crook of her elbow and blinked hard against the late afternoon sun, trying to make sense of the place she'd landed. Black Hollow wasn't much to look at. A single main street stretched about 3 blocks before it gave up and turned into open scrubland. The buildings on either side leaned slightly, like old men too tired to stand straight. There was a general store with a sagging porch, a saloon with one of its shutters hanging by a nail, a feed shop, a barber, and what might have been a church at the far end, though someone had boarded up its front windows. A handful of horses stood tied to posts along the road, flicking flies with their tails, and looking about as enthusiastic about Black Hollow as Evelyn felt. She picked up her carpetbag. The clasp had broken outside of Ridgemont, and she'd been holding it shut with her fist ever since, and stepped onto the boardwalk. Her boots made a hollow sound against the warped planks. A few people glanced her way. Nobody smiled. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store stopped mid-stroke and stared. 2 men sitting on a bench outside the saloon leaned toward each other and said something Evelyn couldn't hear. She kept walking. Her stomach had been empty since yesterday morning. The last of her bread had gone stale 2 days before that, and she'd eaten it anyway, chewing slowly to make it feel like more than it was. Now her head floated a little with each step, and the edges of her vision kept going soft. She needed food. She needed water. She needed someone to tell her where she could sleep without getting robbed again. The general store seemed like the best bet. Evelyn pushed through the door, setting off a small bell overhead, and found herself in a dim room that smelled like dried tobacco and leather. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, rope, bolts of cloth, jars of nails. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s with a broad face and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up when she entered, and his expression went from neutral to cautious in about half a second. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for work," Evelyn said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. She cleared her throat. "Anything at all. Cleaning, cooking, mending, I'm not particular." The man, a small wooden sign on the counter, said Dale Hutchins, proprietor, studied her for a long moment. His eyes moved from her dust-covered shoes to the torn hem of her skirt to the carpetbag she clutched against her chest like a shield. "You just come in on the stage?" "I did." "From where?" "Ridgemont. Before that, St. Louis." "Long way to travel for a place like this," he said. There was no warmth in it, just observation. "I wasn't exactly aiming for Black Hollow," Evelyn said. "I ran out of money before I ran out of road." Dale Hutchins pushed his spectacles up his nose and shook his head slowly. "Can't help you. Don't need anyone right now. You might try the saloon. Martha Kinney runs the kitchen over there. But I'll warn you, she's not the friendliest." "I'll take unfriendly if it comes with a meal." He almost smiled at that. Almost. "You got anywhere to stay tonight?" "Not yet. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Calloway runs it. She'll want payment up front, though." Evelyn nodded, keeping her face still. She had exactly 11 cents in the lining of her carpetbag, sewn into the hem where she'd hidden it out of pure instinct 2 weeks ago. 11 cents wouldn't buy a night anywhere. "Thank you," she said, and turned to leave. "Miss—" She stopped. Dale Hutchins was fiddling with something behind the counter. He came up with a small tin of crackers and set it on the wooden surface between them. "On the house," he said. You look like you could use it. Evelyn stared at the crackers. Her pride wanted to refuse. Her stomach won the argument. She picked up the tin, nodded once, and walked out without another word. If she'd spoken, her voice would have cracked, and she'd already decided she wasn't going to cry in front of anyone in this town. She sat on the edge of the boardwalk with her feet in the dust and ate the crackers one at a time, slowly, the way her mother had taught her to eat when food was scarce. Make your body believe there's plenty, her mother used to say. Chew like a rich woman. Swallow like you've got seconds coming. Her mother had died in a rented room above a hat shop in St. Louis, with nothing to her name but a wool blanket and a tin of sewing needles. Evelyn had been 19. That was 6 years ago. Since then, she'd worked as a seamstress, a laundry maid, a kitchen girl in a boarding house not much different from the one Dale Hutchins had just described. She'd saved every penny she could, dreaming of something better. A little house, maybe, a garden, a life that didn't smell like other people's dirty shirts. And then Marcus Leary had walked into the boarding house one Tuesday afternoon with a pressed suit and a smile that made you feel like the only person in the room. He was a marriage broker, he said, specialized in matching respectable women from the East with established men out West. Ranchers, miners, businessmen looking for wives. For a fee, of course, $240. Everything Evelyn had. He'd shown her letters, photographs, testimonials from happy couples. He'd shown her a daguerreotype of a man named Thomas Whitfield, a cattle rancher in Wyoming Territory, who was looking for a wife of good character and didn't mind if she came from modest means. Evelyn had handed over every cent. 3 weeks later, she'd arrived at the address Marcus Leary had given her and found an empty lot. No ranch, no Thomas Whitfield. No one had ever heard of either name. The marriage broker's office in St. Louis was closed when she wrote back. The landlady told her Marcus had left town the day after Evelyn's money cleared. She'd spent her last dollars on stagecoach fare heading west, because going back east meant going back to nothing, and at least out here the nothing was different. One town bled into another. She'd worked a few days here, a few days there, always moving, always running out of welcome before she ran out of hunger. And now Black Hollow. The end of the line, in every sense she could think of. The crackers were gone. Evelyn folded the tin shut and tucked it into her carpetbag. The sun was getting lower, painting the scrubland in shades of copper and dried blood. She needed to find the saloon, find this Martha Kinney, and hope that Unfriendly came with a paycheck. The saloon was called The Broken Bit. A hand-painted sign hung over the door showing a horse's bridle with a snapped piece of metal. Inside, it was mostly empty. A few men nursing drinks at scattered tables, a bartender polishing glasses with a rag that looked dirtier than the glasses themselves. The air tasted like stale beer and sawdust. Martha Kinney turned out to be a heavy-set woman in her 40s with red hands and a permanent scowl. She was chopping onions in the back kitchen when Evelyn found her, and she didn't stop chopping when Evelyn explained what she wanted. "I don't need help," Martha said. "I'll work for food, just until I can find something more permanent." Martha's knife hit the cutting board with a rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk. "Where are you from?" "St. Louis, originally." "What brought you here?" Evelyn hesitated. The truth was humiliating, but lies took energy she didn't have. "I was swindled. A man took my savings. I've been traveling west trying to land somewhere." Martha stopped chopping and looked at her properly for the first time. Her eyes were small and sharp, like a bird's. "What kind of swindle?" "Marriage broker. Turned out there was no husband waiting, just an empty lot and a trail that went cold." Something shifted in Martha's face. Not sympathy exactly, more like recognition. Like she'd seen this particular brand of ruin before and wasn't surprised by it. "I can give you supper tonight and maybe breakfast tomorrow," Martha said. "But I can't keep you on. I barely make enough to pay myself. You'd be better off asking around town for domestic work. Some of the ranch families take on help before winter sets in." "Any names you'd recommend?" Martha snorted. "Not many. Most folks around here are barely scraping by themselves. The Grayson family's the only one with real money, and they don't hire women who show up out of nowhere looking like they slept in a ditch." Evelyn didn't argue with the description. She probably did look like she'd slept in a ditch. She'd slept in worse. "There's one other option," Martha said, turning back to her onions. "Though I wouldn't recommend it to my worst enemy." "What's that?" "Silas Mercer." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Even the bartender, who was a full room away, seemed to stiffen. He's got a ranch up in the hills, Martha continued. About 12 miles north, lives alone, has for years. The whole town steers clear of him. Why? Martha set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Evelyn with an expression that was half warning, half dare. Because he nearly killed a man with his bare hands about 5 years back. Beat him so bad, the man lost the use of one arm. Sheriff didn't even try to arrest him. Folks were too scared of what he'd do. He comes into town maybe twice a year for supplies. Doesn't talk to anyone. Doesn't look at anyone. Just loads up his wagon and disappears back into those mountains like a ghost. And you think he might need help? I think he lives alone in a cabin that's falling apart, eats like a man who doesn't care if he wakes up tomorrow, and hasn't had a civil conversation with another human being in half a decade. Martha picked up her knife again. Whether that means he needs help or not, I couldn't tell you. I can tell you nobody in this town is foolish enough to ride up there and ask. Evelyn sat at a corner table in the saloon that night, eating a bowl of stew Martha had grudgingly ladled out for her, and thought about Silas Mercer. The more she thought, the more she heard. The men at the other tables talked about him the way people talk about bad weather, not with hatred exactly, but with a kind of resigned wariness. He was a force to be avoided, a problem best left alone. His daddy was the same way, one man said to his drinking companion. Mean as a snake and twice as quiet. Died up there in those hills and nobody found him for 2 weeks. Silas buried him himself, the other man said. Dug the grave, put him in, covered it up. Didn't tell a soul. That ain't normal. Nothing about that family's normal. Evelyn finished her stew, mopping up the last of the broth with a piece of bread that was mostly crust. She was tired down to her bones. Her feet ached. Her back ached. The cracker tin in her carpetbag was empty, and her 11 cents weren't going to multiply overnight. She thought about the empty lot in Wyoming where Thomas Whitfield was supposed to be waiting. She thought about Marcus Leary's smile, how convincing it had been, how she'd handed over her entire life savings without a single moment of doubt. She thought about her mother dying above the hat shop and the sewing needles that were the only inheritance she'd ever received. Then she thought about a man living alone in a falling-down cabin in the mountains, eating like someone who didn't care about tomorrow. She'd been afraid before. Afraid hadn't killed her yet. The next morning, she found Dale Hutchins opening up his store and asked him how to get to the Mercer place. He stared at her like she'd asked for directions to the surface of the sun. You don't want to go up there. I do, actually. Miss, I don't know what Martha told you. She told me enough. How do I get there? Dale took off his spectacles and cleaned them on his shirt, which was a thing he did. Evelyn was beginning to notice when he needed time to think. North Road out of town, follow the creek about 8 miles, then take the fork that goes uphill to the left. It's another 4 miles from there. You'll see a split-rail fence when you're close. The cabin sits in a clearing about a 1/4 mile past that. Thank you. You're going to walk 12 miles into the mountains to ask a man who beat someone half to death if you can come live with him. I'm going to offer him a fair trade, work for shelter. Dale put his spectacles back on and looked at her with something between pity and wonder. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. Probably both, Evelyn said. Evelyn. She left Black Hollow before the town was fully awake. The North Road was really just a wagon track, 2 ruts with grass growing between them, winding through scrubland that gradually gave way to pine forest as the elevation climbed. The creek Dale had mentioned ran alongside the road, sometimes close enough to touch, sometimes disappearing behind rocks and trees before reappearing 100 yards later. Evelyn walked. The carpetbag got heavier with every mile, and she shifted it from hand to hand until both arms burned. The sun was warm, but the air had a bite to it. Autumn was coming fast up here, and she could feel it in the way the wind moved through the pines, sharp and clean, and carrying the smell of something cold. By the time she reached the fork, her feet were blistered and her calves were screaming. She sat on a rock beside the creek and soaked her feet in the water, which was so cold it made her gasp. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals in lazy spirals. The world was quiet in a way that St. Louis had never been. No clatter of carriages, no shouting vendors, no factory whistles. Just wind and water and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the trees. She dried her feet on the hem of her skirt and kept going. The left fork climbed steeply. The wagon track narrowed to barely a path, and in places, fallen branches blocked the way and she had to scramble over or around them. The trees grew closer together up here, their trunks thick with moss, their branches blocking out chunks of sky. It felt like walking into a room that was slowly closing its door. After another hour, she saw the fence. Split rail, just like Dale had said. Some sections were in decent repair. Others had collapsed entirely, the rails scattered on the ground like broken bones. She followed the fence line until it turned, and then she saw the cabin. It sat in a clearing that might once have been well kept but had gone wild. Tall grass grew right up to the front steps. The porch roof sagged on one side, held up by a post that had started to lean. A woodpile stood beside the cabin, stacked but disorganized. Some logs neatly placed, others just thrown on top. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. There was a barn behind the cabin, and a corral attached to it where a single dark horse stood watching Evelyn approach with ears pricked forward and nostrils flared. A few chickens pecked at the dirt near the porch steps. An axe was embedded in a stump near the woodpile, its handle worn smooth. Evelyn stopped about 50 feet from the front door and set her carpetbag down in the grass. Her heart was hammering and her mouth had gone dry, but she kept her back straight and her chin up. "Hello," she called. "My name is Evelyn Hart. I walked from town to speak with you." Nothing happened for a long moment. The smoke kept rising. The horse kept watching. A chicken wandered past her feet. Then the door opened and Silas Mercer stepped onto the porch. He was bigger than she'd expected, tall, with wide shoulders and arms that looked like they'd been built for pulling stumps out of the ground. His hair was dark and too long, falling past his collar in rough waves. A scar ran from just below his left eye to the corner of his jaw. Not a clean line, but a ragged one, like whatever had made it hadn't been sharp enough to cut clean. He didn't say anything. He just stood on the porch and looked at her with eyes that were so pale they barely had color. Gray maybe, or something between gray and blue. Cold eyes, watchful eyes. The kind that made you feel like you were being measured for a coffin. Evelyn swallowed hard. Every instinct she had was telling her to pick up her bag and walk back down that mountain. Her legs wanted to move. Her hands were shaking. She stayed. "I know you don't know me," she said, "and I know you probably don't want company, but I'm going to say my piece anyway, and then you can decide." Silas leaned against the porch rail, which creaked under his weight. He still didn't speak. His expression hadn't changed since the moment he'd stepped outside. Flat, unreadable, like a rock face. "I need a place to stay," Evelyn said. "I'm broke. I've been traveling for weeks, and the town down there can't help me. I'm offering you a trade. I'll cook for you, clean for you, mend your clothes, tend your garden if you've got one, and do whatever other work needs doing around this place. In exchange, I need a roof and meals. That's it. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a fair deal." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Evelyn had ever heard. The wind moved through the pines. The horse snorted. Somewhere behind the cabin, a crow called out, and another answered. "You walked 12 miles to say that?" Silas's voice was deep and rough, like something that had been buried for a long time and was only now breaking the surface. There was no friendliness in it, but there was no cruelty either, just a flat, tired neutrality. "I did." "In those shoes?" Evelyn looked down at her boots. They were city boots, thin-soled and cracked at the toe. One of the laces had been replaced with a piece of twine. "They're the only ones I've got." "Town send you up here?" "Nobody sent me. Martha Kinney mentioned your name, and I made my own decision." "Martha Kinney." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a reaction, but the shadow of one. "What'd she say about me?" Evelyn hesitated, then decided on honesty. "She said you nearly killed a man. She said nobody in town is foolish enough to come up here. And you came anyway." "I did." "Why?" "Because I've been lied to, cheated, and left with nothing by people the whole world considers respectable. A man with a bad reputation doesn't scare me half as much as another man with a good one." That landed somewhere. She could see it. The faintest shift in his posture, like a wall developing a hairline crack. He looked at her for a long time, and she looked right back, and neither of them blinked. "You know how to cook?" he said finally. "I do." "You know how to keep your mouth shut and not ask questions that aren't your business?" "I can manage that." "You know this isn't a boarding house? There's no leaving when you feel like it. Winter comes early up here, and once the snow sets in, that road is gone until spring. I understand. He pushed off the porch rail and stood straight. He was even taller than she'd thought. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. There's a room off of the back of the cabin, he said. It was my mother's. It's got a bed and a door that locks. You can have it. You pull your weight or you leave. I don't repeat myself and I don't explain things twice. If that works for you, bring your bag inside. He turned and walked back through the door without waiting for her answer. Evelyn stood in the clearing with the wind pulling at her hair and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She looked at the sagging porch, the wild grass, the dark doorway of a stranger's cabin. Then she picked up her carpetbag and walked inside. The cabin was dim after the brightness outside. It took her eyes a moment to adjust, and when they did, she found herself standing in a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, black with years of smoke. A rough-hewn table sat in the center with two chairs that didn't match. The kitchen area was a cook stove, a pump-handled sink, and shelves lined with jars, cans, and a few cracked dishes. It wasn't dirty, exactly, but it had the look of a place that had been maintained by someone who saw maintenance as a chore rather than a habit. Dust lay in the corners. The window over the sink was clouded with grime. A pile of clothes sat in a heap near the fireplace. Torn shirts, a pair of trousers with a ripped knee, socks with holes big enough to put a fist through. Silas was standing by the cook stove, pouring coffee from a dented tin pot. He didn't offer her any. "Room's through there," he said, nodding toward a door at the back of the cabin. Evelyn found the room. It was small, barely big enough for the narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a bureau with a cracked mirror on top. The bed was stripped to a bare mattress. A patchwork quilt was folded at the foot, faded but clean. The window looked out onto the back of the property, where the tree line started about 30 yards from the cabin wall. She set her carpetbag on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was lumpy and the springs creaked, but it was a bed. A real bed with a door that locked, in a room that was hers. She pressed her hands against her face and breathed. When she came back out, Silas was gone. Through the window, she could see him by the woodpile, splitting logs with the kind of mechanical intensity that suggested he was working off something that had nothing to do with firewood. She watched him for a moment, the way the axe rose and fell, the way his shoulders moved, the rigid set of his jaw, and then she turned to the pile of torn clothes by the fireplace. She found a needle and thread in the bottom drawer of the bureau in her room, next to a Bible with a woman's name written inside the front cover. Sarah Mercer. His mother, probably. Evelyn set the Bible aside, took the needle and thread, and carried the pile of clothes to the table. She started mending. It took hours. Some of the tiers were old. The fabric around them had softened and thinned, and she had to reinforce it before she could close the gaps. She worked carefully, the way her mother had taught her, making small stitches that would hold under strain. Her mother's hands had been rough from needlework, the fingertips permanently calloused, and Evelyn's were the same. It was the one skill she'd never lost, no matter how far she'd traveled or how low she'd fallen. By the time the light coming through the windows had turned amber, she'd mended 6 shirts, 3 pairs of trousers, and a coat with a torn lining. She folded them neatly and stacked them on one of the chairs. Then she turned to the kitchen. The cook stove was cold. She found matches on the shelf and lit the fire, feeding it kindling until it caught, and then adding 2 small logs from the pile beside the hearth. The pantry, if you could call a collection of half-empty shelves a pantry, held beans, salt pork, flour, a tin of lard, some coffee, a sack of potatoes with sprouts growing from them, and a jar of dried apple slices that might have been there since the previous winter. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Evelyn made biscuits from the flour and lard, cooked the salt pork until it was crispy, opened a can of beans and heated them on the stove, and fried sliced potatoes in the pork fat until they were golden. She set the table with the least cracked dishes she could find, poured 2 cups of coffee, and waited. Silas came inside when the smell of food reached the porch. He stopped in the doorway and stared at the table like he'd walked into the wrong cabin. "Sit down," Evelyn said. "It's nothing fancy." He sat. He looked at the plate. He looked at the mended clothes on the chair. He looked at Evelyn, who was sitting across from him with her own plate and trying very hard to act like this was normal. "You did all this," he said. That was the deal. He picked up his fork and ate. He ate the way a man eats when he's been feeding himself badly for years, quickly, without pause, as if the food might vanish if he stopped. He cleaned his plate in minutes and sat back in his chair, staring at the empty dish with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite name. "There's more biscuits," she said. He took 2 more, ate them slower this time. They didn't talk during the meal. Evelyn didn't push it. She'd made her offer, he'd accepted, and now the rest was just work and time, and 2 people figuring out how to exist in the same small space without stepping on each other. After dinner, Silas went outside again. Evelyn washed the dishes, dried them, and put them away. She banked the fire in the cook stove, swept the floor. The broom she found in the corner was missing half its bristles, but still worked, and wiped down the table. When she went to her room, she found a folded blanket on the bed that hadn't been there before. It was thick, wool, and smelled like cedar. She held it up and looked at it. Then she set it on the bed, changed into her nightclothes, and lay down under it. The ceiling above her was rough-cut planks with gaps between them where the firelight from the main room flickered through. She could hear the wind outside, the creak of the cabin settling, and somewhere far off, the long wail of a coyote. She was alone on a mountain with a man who'd beaten someone nearly to death. She had no money, no friends, no way to leave, even if she wanted to. The nearest town thought she was crazy, and they were probably right. But the blanket was warm, and the bed was real, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't sleeping in a doorway or under a bridge or in the back of a wagon that smelled like cattle. She closed her eyes. The first week was brutal. Evelyn quickly discovered that maintaining an isolated mountain cabin was nothing like running a kitchen in a St. Louis boarding house. Everything was harder, took longer, and fought back. Water had to be pumped by hand at the sink, and the pump was temperamental. Some mornings it took 50 strokes before anything came out, and what came out was rusty for the first minute. Firewood had to be carried from the pile to the cabin multiple times a day, and the logs were heavy enough to make her arms shake. The cook stove had a draft problem that filled the cabin with smoke if the wind blew from the east, and the wind blew from the east a lot. Silas gave her no instructions. He woke before dawn, ate whatever she'd left out for him, and disappeared. Sometimes to the barn, sometimes into the forest, sometimes so far that she couldn't even hear the ring of his axe. He came back at midday, ate, left again. Came back at dusk, ate, sat by the fire for an hour reading or staring at nothing, and went to his room. They exchanged maybe 20 words a day. Good morning, food's ready, fire's low, going to the barn. That was it. Evelyn didn't mind the silence. What she minded was the cold. Autumn arrived in the mountains like someone slamming a door. One morning the air was crisp but bearable. The next, frost coated every surface, and the water in the bucket by the sink had a skin of ice on it. The cabin had gaps in the walls where the chinking had crumbled, and the wind came through them like knives. Evelyn stuffed the gaps with rags and old newspapers she found in the barn, but it was a temporary fix at best. "Winter supplies," she said one evening, breaking the usual silence. "What have you got stored?" Silas looked at her from across the table. "Enough." "Enough for one person or 2? He didn't answer right away. She watched him think about it, watched the calculation play out behind those pale eyes. He'd been living alone long enough that the arrival of a second mouth to feed was clearly something he hadn't fully accounted for. "I'll go hunting this week," he said finally. "I'll smoke whatever you bring back. I know how to cure meat." He raised an eyebrow. It was the most expression she'd seen from him yet. "Where did a city woman learn to cure meat?" "Boarding house I worked at in Jefferson City. The cook was a former trapper. He taught me." Silas studied her for a moment, then went back to his coffee. The next day he left before dawn with his rifle and didn't come back until late afternoon. He brought 2 deer, already field-dressed. Evelyn had built a smoking rack behind the cabin using branches and rope she'd found in the barn, following the method old Pete Callahan, the trapper-turned-cook, had shown her 3 years ago. They worked side by side that evening, cutting the venison into strips for smoking. It was the first time they'd been in close physical proximity for more than a few seconds, and Evelyn was acutely aware of his size, the way his hands dwarfed the knife, the way he moved with a careful deliberateness that suggested he was always conscious of how much damage he could do if he stopped being careful. "You're good with a knife," she said. "Had a lot of practice." "Hunting?" "Among other things." She didn't ask what other things. She'd promised not to ask questions that weren't her business, and she meant to keep that promise. but she noticed how the scar on his face seemed to tighten when he was concentrating, pulling the skin just slightly, and she wondered about the story behind it the way you wonder about the last chapter of a book you're not sure you want to finish. The smoking took 3 days. By the end of it, they had enough dried venison to last well into winter, hung in the back of the cabin where the cold air would keep it. Evelyn also found wild onions growing along the creek and dug up enough to fill a basket. She pickled them in vinegar she made from the dried apple slices, using a recipe she half remembered and half improvised. Silas tried one of the pickled onions that evening and made a sound that might have been approval. It was the closest thing to a compliment Evelyn had received since arriving. The cabin slowly changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in the way a neglected thing changes when someone starts paying attention to it. Evelyn scrubbed the windows until light actually came through them. She swept the porch, nailed down the loose boards, and propped up the sagging section of the roof with a new post she fashioned from a straight pine branch Silas had left beside the woodpile without comment. She found Sarah Mercer's recipes in a small wooden box hidden in the back of the kitchen shelf. Handwritten on yellowed paper in a cramped, careful hand. Apple butter, cornbread with honey, venison stew with wild thyme, a recipe for soap that used rendered fat and lye from wood ash. Evelyn tried the cornbread first. It came out lopsided and a little burned on the bottom, but Silas ate 3 pieces. "Your mother's recipe," Evelyn said carefully. Silas's fork stopped moving. He looked at the cornbread, then at Evelyn, and something shifted in his face. Not quite pain, not quite anger, but something older and more worn than either. The look of a man who has spent years building walls around a room he doesn't want to enter, and just heard someone knock on the door. "She died when I was 14, he said. It was the most personal thing he'd ever told her. He said it flat, without emotion, like he was reporting the weather. Then he went back to eating. Evelyn didn't press. She cleared the dishes, washed them, dried them, and when she passed his chair on the way to her room, she paused just long enough to say, "It was a good recipe." She heard him exhale, a long, slow breath that carried more weight than any words could have. She went to her room, closed the door, and stood in the dark for a while, holding the wooden box of recipes against her chest like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever been trusted with. Which, in a way, it was. The town didn't forget about her. She found that out 2 weeks into her stay when Silas came back from one of his rare supply runs with a face like a thundercloud and knuckles white around the reins of the wagon. "What happened?" Evelyn asked. She was on the porch, patching a hole in one of the blankets. "Nothing." Silas. He tied off the horse with more force than necessary and started unloading supplies, flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, stacking them on the porch without meeting her eyes. "People talk, that's all." "What are they saying?" "Doesn't matter. It matters if it's about me." He stopped, set down the sack of flour, stood with his hands at his sides, staring at the ground. "They're saying you're either my prisoner or that I'm keeping you up here against your will. Some of them. Others are saying you're—" He stopped again, his jaw working. "It doesn't matter what they're saying." Evelyn put down the blanket. "I'll go down there myself and set them straight." "No." "Why not?" "Because it'll make things worse. They've got their story about me and they're sticking to it. You showing up and defending me will just give them more to talk about." "I don't care what they talk about." "I do." He picked up the flour and carried it inside. The door banged shut behind him. Evelyn sat on the porch with the blanket in her lap and thought about that. He cared. Not about the insults. She was pretty sure insults had stopped landing on Silas Mercer a long time ago. He cared about what they were saying about her, about the damage their words could do to her reputation, whatever was left of it. It was the first time she'd realized he was thinking about someone other than himself. She finished patching the blanket and didn't bring it up again. But she noticed over the following days that Silas had started doing things without being asked. Small things, quiet things. A pail of fresh water left by the kitchen door each morning before she woke. A stack of kindling, split fine, beside the cook stove. A pair of heavy boots, too big for her, but stuffed with rags at the toes to make them fit, set outside her door one evening with no explanation. She put on the boots the next morning and wore them to the creek to fetch water. They were warm and solid and kept the cold out in a way her city boots never had. When she came back to the cabin, Silas was on the porch, mending a bridle. He glanced at the boots, then at her face, and went back to the bridle. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. That night, after dinner, Evelyn built the fire up high against the growing cold and sat at the table with the box of recipes open in front of her. Silas sat in his chair by the fireplace, a book in his lap. The lamp between them cast a circle of yellow light that didn't quite reach the walls. "The Grayson family," Evelyn said. "Martha Kinney mentioned them. She said they're the most powerful family in Black Hollow." Silas turned a page. "They are. She also said they spread stories about you." The page turning stopped. "That a question or a statement?" "Statement. I'm not asking what happened between you and them. I'm just saying I've heard the name." He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like breathing. "Harlan Grayson," Silas said finally, "owns half the land around Black Hollow. His father owned the other half before that. They've been running that town since before I was born. And they don't like you. Harlan Grayson doesn't like anyone he can't control. I'm just the one who made that clear in a way he couldn't ignore." He looked at her across the firelight. "That's as much as I'm going to say about it." "That's enough." He held her gaze for a beat longer than usual, and something passed between them. Not warmth, not trust, but the first fragile recognition that they were no longer just two strangers sharing a roof. They were two people with damage, living in the same small circle of light, starting to learn each other's edges. Silas went back to his book. Evelyn went back to the recipes. The fire burned between them, steady and quiet, pushing the dark a little further from the walls. October stripped the mountains bare. The aspens went gold first, then red, then naked, their leaves scattering across the clearing in drifts that crunched underfoot when Evelyn crossed the yard each morning. The pines stayed green but stiffened against the cold, their needles edged with frost most mornings now. The air sharp enough that her lungs ached after the first few breaths. She'd learned to dress for it. 2 pairs of stockings under her skirt, a wool shirt under her bodice. The heavy boots Silas had left at her door, the rags inside them replaced now with proper wool socks she'd knitted from yarn she found in a chest beneath her bed. Sarah Mercer's yarn, untouched for over a decade, still soft and usable. Evelyn had never knitted before in her life. She'd taught herself by lamplight, ripping out rows that turned out wrong, starting over until her fingers stopped fumbling and the stitches lined up the way they were supposed to. The socks were lopsided. One was longer than the other. Silas had said nothing when she'd offered him a pair of his own, but he'd worn them the next day and every day after that. The cabin had warmed too, in ways that had nothing to do with the fire. Evelyn had scrubbed the floors with lye soap until the wood gave up its grime and showed its real color, a soft honey brown that caught the firelight in the evenings. She'd taken down the heavy oilcloth that had blacked out the kitchen window and replaced it with a length of unbleached muslin she'd found in the bottom of the chest, hemmed neatly and tacked into place. Light came through it now, diffuse and gentle, and made the whole room feel less like a cave and more like somewhere a person might actually want to be. Silas had noticed. He hadn't said anything about it directly, but Evelyn caught him pausing in the doorway one morning, just standing there, looking at the kitchen with something she couldn't quite read on his face. He'd stayed like that for a long moment. Then he'd taken his hat off the peg, set his jaw, and walked out into the cold without a word. She wondered sometimes what it cost him to come back to a cabin that no longer looked like the one he'd been living in, whether it was a comfort or a wound, whether the smell of bread baking and the sound of her humming as she worked were soothing or unbearable. He never said. He never would say. She'd accepted that about him the way she'd accepted the cold mornings and the temperamental pump, as a fact of life that wasn't going to change just because she wanted it to. What had changed was the silence. It used to feel like a wall between them. Now it felt more like weather, present, sometimes heavy, but not personal anymore. They could sit in the same room for an hour without speaking and not feel the awkwardness of 2 strangers forced into proximity. They could pass each other in the doorway and brush sleeves, and neither of them flinched. That was something. Evelyn wasn't sure what to call it, but it was something. One morning near the middle of October, she stepped out onto the porch to dump the dishwater and found Silas saddling his horse in the yard. He had his rifle slung across his back and a coil of rope on the saddle horn. The horse, a tall, dark gelding named Drum, she'd learned, though Silas almost never said the name aloud, was stamping in the cold, breath pluming from his nostrils. Going somewhere? She asked. Cattle drift down toward the lower meadow this time of year, Silas said. I need to push them back up before the first snow. Otherwise, they'll wander into Grayson Land, and I'll have to ride down to fetch them out. Don't want to do that if I can help it. How many head? 11. Not much of a herd, but it's what I've got. How long will you be gone? 2 days. Maybe 3. He tightened the cinch and looked at her over the saddle. There's enough wood split for a week, dried meat in the back. You know how to reload the rifle by the door if you need to. Evelyn nodded. He'd shown her 2 weeks back without asking if she wanted to learn. He just set the rifle on the table one afternoon, walked her through loading and unloading it, and made her do it 5 times in a row until she didn't fumble anymore. She hadn't asked why. She'd already figured out that Silas Mercer did things in his own time and his own way, and that the things he chose to teach her were the things he thought she'd need. You'll be all right up here alone? He asked. It was the most direct question he'd ever asked her about herself. I'll be all right. He swung up into the saddle. Drum sidestepped beneath him, eager to move. Silas held him steady and looked down at her, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something else. Something that mattered, maybe. But then he just touched the brim of his hat and turned the horse toward the trees. She watched him ride out until the pines swallowed him. Then she went back inside, washed the breakfast dishes, and tried to settle into the strange quiet of having the place to herself. The first day was easy enough. She baked bread, mended a tear in her own skirt, took the axe out to the woodpile, and split a few rounds. Badly, slowly, but well enough to add to the stack. She walked down to the creek with a bucket and washed the bedding from her room. By dusk, she was tired in the good way, the way she hadn't been tired in St. Louis, where the exhaustion was always hollow and pointless. Here it had weight. It earned her supper. The second day brought the first real snow. It started before dawn, fine and quiet, the kind that didn't seem like much until you looked outside 2 hours later and realized the clearing had gone white. By mid-morning, it was coming down harder, fat flakes drifting in the still air, settling on the porch rail and the woodpile and the back of the chickens, who clustered miserably under the lean-to behind the cabin. Evelyn shooed them inside the small coop and latched the door. She added 2 more logs to the fire. She brewed a pot of coffee and drank it standing at the window, watching the snow build. By noon, the world outside the cabin had simplified itself into white and dark green and the bone gray of bare branches. The wind picked up, the kind of wind that drove snow sideways and worked its way into every gap in the chinking. Evelyn checked the rags she'd stuffed earlier, tightened them, added more. By mid-afternoon, she was starting to worry, not for herself. The cabin would hold. The food was good for weeks. She had wood, water, blankets, time. What she worried about was Silas, out there with 11 head of cattle and a horse and a rifle, riding through weather she hadn't seen the equal of in her life. She told herself he knew what he was doing. He'd lived in these mountains since he was a boy. He'd been through worse. But she kept walking to the window anyway, kept staring at the gap in the trees where he'd ridden out, kept listening past the wind for the sound of hooves. By dark, there was nothing but wind. She didn't sleep well. She kept the fire fed all night, getting up every few hours to add wood, sitting in his chair by the hearth wrapped in the wool blanket from her bed. The cabin creaked and shifted around her. Somewhere out behind the barn, a tree branch cracked under the weight of the snow and came down with a sound like a gunshot. Evelyn flinched. The chickens didn't react. The fire popped and resettled. She thought about her mother, about the rented room above the hat shop, about the way grief made some people smaller and other people emptier, and how she'd always been afraid she'd become one of the empty ones. She thought about Marcus Leary's smile and how badly she'd needed to believe in it. She thought about Silas's hands holding a knife at the smoking rack, careful and deliberate, the way he didn't seem to know what to do with his own kindness when it leaked out of him. She thought about the boots at her door, the water pail, the split kindling, the fire burned down. She built it back up. He came back just before noon the next day. She heard Drum's hooves on the packed snow of the trail before she saw anything, and she was out on the porch with her shawl around her shoulders by the time horse and rider broke through the trees. Silas rode hunched in the saddle, snow caked across the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his coat. His face was raw red where the wind had hit it. There was blood on his sleeve, not much, but enough to see. She came down off the porch without thinking. What happened? Nothing. He swung down stiffly. The leg he landed on buckled, and he caught himself against the saddle. Cow caught me with a horn. It's nothing. Get inside. I'll see to drum. He looked at her like he was about to argue. Then he looked at the cabin, at the smoke coming from the chimney, at the warm yellow light spilling from the window, and he handed her the reins without a word. Evelyn led the horse to the barn. She'd never unsaddled a horse in her life, but she'd watched Silas do it enough times to fumble her way through. Drum was patient with her. She got the saddle off, hung it on the rack, rubbed him down with a coarse cloth the way she'd seen Silas do, and forked hay into his stall. By the time she finished, her hands were aching from the cold and her skirt was wet to the knee with snow. She found Silas at the table when she came in. He'd taken off his coat. His shirt was open at the side, and the bloody patch beneath was bigger than she'd thought. "Sit still," she said, dumping her shawl on the chair. "Let me see. It's fine." "Silas." He sat still. She heated water on the stove and gathered what she had: a clean cloth, a needle she boiled in the kettle, thread, the small bottle of whiskey she'd found in the back of the pantry and never said a word about. The wound was a ragged tear along his ribs, maybe 4 inches long, deep enough to need stitching. The horn had gone in clean but pulled out raw. He'd lost blood, but not as much as he should have for a wound like that. He must have packed it with snow. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I figured." She poured the whiskey over it. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. She glanced at his face and found him staring at the wall across the room with the kind of fixed concentration that comes from a man who has decided pain is not allowed to win. "You could drink some of that," she said, "instead of just bleeding it onto the floor." The corner of his mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. It might not have been. "Save it." She threaded the needle and bent close to the wound. Her hands were steady. She'd learned to stitch finer things than skin, silk, lace, the delicate seams of a lady's bodice. Skin wasn't so different. You went slow. You kept your stitches even. You didn't think about the fact that the fabric was warm and breathing. He didn't flinch when the needle went in. He didn't flinch on the second stitch or the third. Around the 6th, his breath caught. Just a small intake, almost nothing. And she paused. "You can curse if you want to," she said. "I'm fine. I'm just saying, I wouldn't hold it against you. Keep going." She kept going. 11 stitches in all. By the time she tied off the thread and cleaned the wound a final time, his shirt was ruined and there was a streak of blood across the back of her hand, but the bleeding had stopped and the edges of the cut were drawn together neatly. She bandaged him with strips torn from one of the older sheets. When she was done, she sat back in her chair and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," he said. He said it quietly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. "You're welcome." He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't before. Not the measuring look from the porch on her first day. Something else. Something that took in her tired eyes and the blood on her hand and the way her hair had come loose from its pins. Then he looked down at the table. "You should have something to eat," she said, standing up. "And then you're going to sleep. I should check the—" "You're going to sleep, Silas. The cattle are wherever they are. Drum is fed and dry. Whatever else needs doing can wait." He didn't argue. She heated stew from the night before. He ate slowly, one arm hanging stiff at his side. When he was done, he stood up, and his face went pale, and he sat back down hard enough to make the chair groan. "Up," she said. "I'll help you to the chair by the fire." "I can walk." "I'm sure you can. I'm still going to help you." She got under his good arm and took some of his weight. He was heavier than she'd expected, and she was smaller than he probably realized, but they made it the 8 feet to the chair without falling. She tucked the wool blanket around him and added 2 logs to the fire and stood back, hands on her hips. "You sleep right there," she said. "I'll wake you when supper's ready." Evelyn, it was the first time he'd said her name. Not Miss Hart. Not nothing at all. Just Evelyn, soft and rough, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. She turned. "What?" He looked at her from the chair. He looked like a man who had ridden through a blizzard and been gored by a cow and stitched up in his own kitchen by a woman he barely knew, and who didn't have any words left for any of it. "Nothing," he said. "Thank you." "You said that already." "I know." She turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her face. She heard him settle deeper into the chair. Within a few minutes, his breathing had evened out, and when she glanced over her shoulder, He was asleep with his head tipped back against the wood and the firelight playing across his scarred face. She stood watching him for longer than she meant to. Then she went to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands pressed against her eyes. She didn't cry. She'd stopped crying somewhere between St. Louis and Black Hollow, and she wasn't ready to start again. But she sat there for a while, feeling something she didn't have a name for, and when she came back out to start supper, she made sure her face was composed. He slept through the afternoon and woke for supper and slept again until morning. By morning his color was better and the bandage was still clean. He stayed inside that day, which was the first day she'd ever seen him stay inside, and he spent most of it watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You should rest," she said at one point when he tried to get up to bring in firewood. "I've been resting." "Rest more." He sat down. He didn't argue. By the afternoon, he'd taken down a small wooden carving from the mantel, a horse, no bigger than her hand, beautifully detailed, and was running a piece of fine sandpaper across one of its hooves. She'd noticed the carving before but hadn't asked about it. "You make that?" she asked, kneading bread dough at the table. "My father did." "He carved?" "When he wasn't drunk." It was a flat statement, no bitterness in it, but it landed in the room with weight. Evelyn kept her hands moving on the dough and didn't look up. "He taught me," Silas said. "It's the one good thing he taught me." "It's beautiful." "It's all right." He kept sanding. After a while, without looking up, he said, "He died when I was 22. Up here, in this cabin. I didn't go down to town for a doctor because the last doctor we called turned us away when we couldn't pay up front. By the time I figured out he wasn't going to make it on his own, it was too late. I buried him out behind the barn." She didn't say anything. She just kneaded the dough and let him talk if he wanted to. He didn't go on. He sanded for another minute, set the carving back on the mantel, and stared at the fire. "Your turn," he said finally. "My turn?" "You know about my mother and my father. I don't know anything about you." She looked up at him. He was watching her now, and there was no challenge in it, no demand. Just a man who'd been given something and was offering something back in fair trade. She set the dough aside and washed her hands. "My mother was a seamstress in St. Louis," she said. "My father left before I was born. I never met him. Mother and I lived in a rented room above a hat shop. She worked for a dressmaker on Olive Street, and I helped her after school. She died when I was 19, lung sickness, the kind that takes a long time. And after that, I worked. Boarding houses mostly, kitchens. I saved every penny I could." Her voice flattened. $240. That's what I had when a man calling himself a marriage broker convinced me to send it all to him. He promised me a husband, a rancher in Wyoming territory. By the time I got to Wyoming, there was no rancher, no ranch, no broker, just an empty lot, and the realization that I'd been a fool. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's not foolish." "It is." "No, it isn't. Foolish is when you believe something for no reason. You had a reason. You wanted a life. That's not foolish. That's just human." She didn't know what to say to that. She looked down at her hands, which were red and chapped from the lye soap, with 2 small scars across the back from a kitchen accident years ago. They didn't look like the hands of a woman who had ever expected anything good to happen to her. "I came west because I had nothing left to lose," she said. "I worked my way down to Ridgemont and then over to Black Hollow because the stagecoach broke down and the next one wasn't going anywhere I wanted to go. I walked into that town with 11 cents and a broken carpetbag. I walked up to your cabin because Martha Kinney mentioned your name, and I thought—" She stopped. "You thought what?" "I thought a man everyone in town was afraid of was probably less dangerous than a man with a pressed suit and a good smile." He almost laughed. It was the closest she'd ever heard him come to it, a short exhalation through his nose, his mouth twitching at the corner. "That's the truest thing I've heard in years." She smiled at the table. She didn't let him see. The snow held for 3 more days. They settled into a strange new rhythm, the two of them confined to the cabin by the weather, sharing the small space without strain. He sat by the fire and mended tack or read or sanded the small carving. She cooked, mended, baked, kept the fire going. They talked sometimes. Not much, but more than they had. He told her about the mountains in summer, when the meadows were full of wildflowers, and the creek ran so cold it hurt your teeth to drink from it. She told him about St. Louis in winter, the river full of ice, the street lamps making halos in the fog. On the fourth day, the snow stopped. The sky opened up cold and blue, and the world outside the cabin became impossibly bright, every surface throwing sunlight back so hard she had to squint when she went outside. Silas, against her instructions, went out to check on Drum and the chickens. He moved slow, but he moved. That afternoon, she was out at the woodpile when she heard the sound of hooves on the trail. She straightened, the axe loose in her hand. The sound was wrong. Too many hooves, coming too fast. Not Silas's quiet way of riding. She set down the axe and went to the corner of the cabin. 3 riders broke through the trees. 2 men and a younger one, all of them on good horses with new tack. The lead rider was older, perhaps 50, with a heavy mustache and a wool coat that probably cost more than everything Evelyn owned put together. He pulled up his horse 20 feet from the cabin and looked down at her like she was a stain on his shirt. "Mercer," he called out, not to her, to the cabin. "Get out here." Evelyn straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Mercer is resting. Can I help you with something?" The older man's eyes moved to her properly for the first time. He took in her dress, her boots, her chapped hands, the strand of hair across her cheek. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "You must be the woman from town," he said. "The one folks are talking about." "My name is Evelyn Hart, Harlan Grayson." He didn't offer a hand. He didn't get down off his horse. "These are my sons, Royce and Caleb. We need to speak with Mercer about a matter of land." The door of the cabin opened behind her. She heard Silas's slow, careful step on the porch. She didn't turn around. "Then you can speak with him from where you sit, Mr. Grayson," she said. "And you can do it civil, or you can ride back the way you came." There was a beat of silence. Royce Grayson, the older of the sons, broad-shouldered and red-faced, laughed once, sharp. "Pa," he said, "the woman's got teeth." "Shut up, Royce." Harlan Grayson did not take his eyes off Evelyn. "Miss Hart, I have no quarrel with you. I have business with the man who lives here, and that business is none of yours." "He's standing right behind me," Evelyn said. "If you've got something to say to him, say it. I'm not going anywhere." She heard Silas come down the porch step. He came up beside her, one hand resting easy at his side, the other tucked slightly against his ribs where the stitches were. His face had gone hard in a way she hadn't seen before. Not angry, not scared, but closed up tight, every door bolted. "What do you want, Harlan?" Silas said. Harlan Grayson smiled. It was the worst smile Evelyn had ever seen on a human being. Thin, cold, and full of something that had been rotting for a long time. "Just came to welcome your new lady friend to the territory," he said, "and to remind you that the boundary on your western fence is in the wrong place. I want it moved 20 yards east before the first hard freeze. You've got 2 weeks. The boundary's where it's been for 30 years. It's where it's been because nobody's pushed back. I'm pushing back. 2 weeks, Mercer." His eyes flicked to Evelyn again. "And Miss Hart, when you get tired of mountain living and want to come back to town, you remember who runs Black Hollow. I'm a generous man. I take care of folks who know their place." He turned his horse without waiting for an answer. Royce gave Evelyn a long, slow look that made her skin crawl. The younger son, Caleb, barely more than a boy, 16 at most, didn't look at her at all. He kept his eyes on the ground in front of his horse's hooves, and she had the sudden strong sense that he didn't want to be there. The 3 of them rode out the way they'd come. The pines swallowed them. For a long moment, neither Silas nor Evelyn moved. "He's not going to leave it at the fence," she said finally. "No," Silas said. "He's not." She looked up at him. His jaw was set so tight it looked like it might crack. The hand at his ribs had curled into a fist. "Inside," she said. "You're bleeding through the bandage." He looked down. A dark stain had spread across his side. He hadn't even noticed. She got him back inside and changed the dressing and didn't say another word about Harlan Grayson. There was no point. Not yet. Whatever was coming, and they would meet it when it arrived. She set fresh wood on the fire. She put the kettle on. The light from the window had gone golden with late afternoon, and outside the snow lay heavy and quiet across the clearing, and somewhere up in the high country an elk was bugling, its call thin and far and lonely against the cold blue sky. Silas sat in his chair by the fire. Evelyn sat across from him with a basket of mending in her lap. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire burned between them, steady and quiet, and the cabin held against the cold the way it had been holding for 30 years, with everything inside it slowly learning how to belong. The mending lay forgotten in Evelyn's lap. She'd stopped pretending to work on it about 10 minutes after the Graysons rode out, and Silas hadn't said a word about it. He sat across from her with his eyes fixed on the fire, his jaw still tight, one hand pressed flat against his bandaged ribs, as if holding something inside. The kettle began to whistle. Evelyn got up and pulled it off the heat. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the small table beside his chair. "Drink it," she said. "I'm not thirsty." "I didn't ask if you were thirsty." He picked up the cup. He didn't drink. He just held it in both hands, the steam rising past his face. After a long moment, he said, "You shouldn't have spoken to him like that." "Like what?" "Like you weren't afraid of him." "I wasn't afraid of him." "You should be." She sat back down across from him and picked up the mending again, though her hands weren't quite steady enough to work with the needle. "I've been afraid of men in pressed suits, Silas. I'm done with that. Harlan Grayson can ride up here on his fancy horse all he wants. I'm not going to flinch on this porch for him or any man like him." Silas looked at her then. Really looked. The firelight was on one side of his face, and the scar pulled at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes weren't the cold gray she'd seen on her first day. They were something else now. Tired, maybe. Worried in a way he didn't have practice showing. "That's the problem," he said. "He wants a flinch. When he doesn't get one, he keeps pushing until he does. And he won't push at me. He'll push at you." "Let him push." "Evelyn, I came up this mountain because there wasn't a single corner of the world that wanted me. I'm not running again. Not from him. Not from anyone." He held her eyes for a beat too long, then looked back at the fire. He drank his coffee. He didn't say anything else. She finished one row of stitching on the shirt in her lap before her hands gave up and started to shake. She set the mending in the basket and clasped her fingers together so he wouldn't see. She didn't think he saw. He was somewhere else now, somewhere behind his own eyes, and she let him be. The snow held for 2 more days. Then the wind shifted and came in warm from the south. The kind of warm that fooled you into thinking spring might come early before the mountains laughed and snapped back to winter. And the snow began to soften and slip down the roof in slow, heavy sheets. The trail down to Black Hollow turned to mud by mid-morning. Silas was up before dawn the next day. Evelyn heard him moving in the main room, heard the barn doors creak open in the gray light. She pulled on her dress and her shawl and went out. He was saddling Drum. The horse stood patient in the cold, ears flicking. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Town." "For what?" "Supplies." "You just went 2 weeks ago." He tightened the girth without looking at her. "I want to hear what they're saying." She crossed her arms against the chill. "About me, you mean?" "About both of us, but mostly about you." He glanced over the saddle. "Harlan Grayson rode all the way up here to look at you. That's not nothing. He doesn't waste hours on people he doesn't intend to do something to." "So you're going down to spy on him?" "I'm going down to buy salt and listen. Anything I hear is a bonus." She watched him for a moment. He was moving stiffly. The wound was healing, but he'd torn one of the stitches yesterday, hauling a deadfall out of the cattle trail. "Your side," she said. "It's fine." "It's not fine." "It's fine enough for a ride to town." She knew there was no point arguing. She'd learned that about him in the past few weeks. When his mind was set on something, you didn't move him, you just made sure he was carrying everything he needed. She went back inside, wrapped a piece of cold venison and 2 biscuits in a clean cloth, and brought them out to him. She tucked the bundle into his saddlebag without asking permission. "Don't drink the coffee at Martha's," she said. "It's terrible." The corner of his mouth twitched. "I know. Be careful." He paused, the reins in his hand. He looked down at her. "You bar the door when I'm gone." "I will." "And keep the rifle by the bed, not by the door." She frowned. "Why?" "Because if anyone gets through the door, you don't want to have to go past them to reach it." He swung up into the saddle. Drum sidestepped, eager to be moving. "I'll be back tomorrow evening if I can. Day after if the trail goes worse." He didn't wait for her to say goodbye. He turned the horse and rode out into the pines, and she stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded into nothing. She barred the door. She moved the rifle from its peg by the door to the small table beside her bed. She told herself it was foolish to feel the absence of him already. After only an hour, when she'd lived 25 years without ever hearing his name, she told herself a lot of things that day. None of them helped. Silas rode into Black Hollow just before noon. The main street was a slough of half-melted snow and mud, and a few thin lines of smoke rose from chimneys along the main row. He tied Drum outside the general store and went in without taking off his hat. Dale Hutchins looked up from the counter. His expression went through three things in quick succession: surprise, wariness, and something that looked like grudging respect, before settling on neutral. "Mercer," Dale said. "Hutchins, I need salt, 20 pounds, coffee, 2 pounds, and a box of 44s. "All right." Dale started pulling things from the shelves. Silas leaned against the counter and let his eyes drift around the store. Two women stood by the bolt of calico cloth at the back. They had stopped talking the moment he walked in. One of them, Mrs. Calloway from the boarding house, he thought, was staring at him openly, her mouth a flat line. The other had turned her face away. He didn't smile at them. He didn't nod. He just looked back at Dale. "How is she?" Dale said quietly, weighing out coffee. "Who?" "The woman who came in here on the stage. Hart." "She's fine." Dale glanced up over his spectacles. "She didn't strike me as the running back to town type, but I admit I wasn't sure she'd last the first week." "She's lasting." "That's good." Dale wrapped the coffee in brown paper. "There's been talk." "Imagine that." "I don't repeat most of it." "You don't need to hear most of it, but some of it I do think you ought to know." Silas waited. Dale finished wrapping the coffee and set it on the counter. He pushed his spectacles up his nose. "Harlan Grayson came in here 3 days back, sat in the saloon for a couple hours with Royce and that crowd. He was telling anyone who'd listen that a respectable white woman from the East was being held against her will up at your place. He didn't say the word held. He said the word kept. There's a difference, and he meant it." Silas didn't move. What did people say back? Some of them believed him, some of them didn't. Most of them just drank their drinks and didn't argue, which amounts to the same thing as believing him in a town this size. Anyone planning to do something about it? Not that I've heard, but Harlan's the kind of man who gets people to do things without telling them to. Plants a seed and waits. Silas reached into his pocket and put coins on the counter. "How much?" $2 even. He paid. He picked up the supplies. He didn't move. "There's something else, isn't there?" Silas said. Dale was quiet. He wiped the counter with a cloth he didn't need to use. The two women in the back of the store had drifted closer to the front, pretending to look at a shelf of canned peaches. They were listening hard enough that you could feel it across the room. "Royce Grayson said something I didn't like," Dale said, low enough that only Silas could hear. "Said it would be a shame if Miss Hart had an accident on that road between your place and town. Said women traveling alone in this country can run into all sorts of bad luck." Silas's hand tightened on the package of coffee until the paper crackled. He set it down very slowly so he wouldn't crush it. "He said it where I could hear," Dale said. "I think he meant for me to hear. I think he wanted it to get up the mountain." "It got up the mountain." "Mercer." Dale's voice dropped further. "I've known you since you were 12 years old. I knew your mother. I knew your father, for whatever that's worth. I'm not your friend, and I never have been. But I'll tell you this once. Don't go to the saloon today. Don't go looking for Royce. Whatever you've got planned, take it home and sit on it. That boy wants a reason. Don't give him one." Silas looked at Dale for a long time. Dale didn't look away. "Appreciate the salt," Silas said. He picked up the supplies and walked out. He did not go to the saloon. He stood on the boardwalk outside the general store with his packages in his arms and made himself breathe slow through his nose until his hands weren't shaking. Then he loaded the wagon. He'd brought it down with drum harnessed and a sled runner set up for the snow that had since melted, and started back up the mountain road. He didn't stop at the boarding house. He didn't stop at the saloon. He passed 3 men outside the feed store who turned to watch him go, and he didn't look at them either. Halfway up the trail, in a stand of pines where the road bent around a granite outcrop, he saw fresh hoof prints crossing the trail. 2 horses. The prints came from the east, the direction of Grayson land, and went west, into the woods on the far side of the road. He pulled Drum up. He sat in the wagon for a long time looking at those prints. Then he flicked the reins and kept going. The wagon creaked. The trail climbed. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the western ridge, and the light had gone amber and gold across the clearing. Smoke rose from the chimney. The door was barred. The chickens had been brought in for the night. He unhitched Drum and got the supplies onto the porch. He knocked twice, then once. "It's me," he said. The bar lifted. Evelyn opened the door. She was holding the rifle. "Were you going to shoot me?" he said. "If I needed to." He almost smiled. He carried the supplies inside and set them on the table. She watched him do it, her eyes moving across his face the way she'd looked at the cow horn wound, measuring, assessing, looking for damage he hadn't told her about. "Sit down," she said. "There's stew. I need to talk to you first." "Sit down and eat and then talk. You've been on that wagon for 9 hours. He sat. He ate. He didn't taste any of it. When he was done, he pushed the bowl aside and leaned his elbows on the table, and Evelyn sat down across from him with her hands folded. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He didn't soften any of it. He told her what Harlan had said in the saloon, what Royce had said in front of Dale, what the hoofprints he'd seen on the trail meant. He told her that the boundary fight wasn't really about the boundary, that Harlan had been waiting years for an excuse to come for him and now finally had one, and that the excuse, he was sorry to say, was her. Evelyn listened without interrupting. Her hands stayed folded. Her face stayed still. When he finished, she said, "He wants me to leave." "That's the easiest thing he wants. And if I don't leave? Then he'll try to make leaving look like the smart choice. If that doesn't work, he'll try something worse." She was quiet for a long time. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and somewhere up the slope, a tree limb cracked and fell. "You think I should go?" she said. "No." She looked up sharply. "I think you should know," Silas said, "and then I think you should decide. I'm not going to be one more man who tells you what your life ought to look like." Something passed across her face. A small thing, but real. Her jaw worked once. She looked down at her hands. "I came up here with 11 cents and a broken bag," she said quietly. "Nobody owed me a place. You didn't owe me a place. You took me in because I asked, and I've done what I said I'd do, and this is the first roof in 5 years that's felt like mine even a little bit." She lifted her eyes. "I'm not leaving because Harlan Grayson can't stand the idea of a woman making her own decisions. I'd rather take whatever's coming." "Evelyn." "What?" "Whatever's coming might be worse than you can stand." "Then it'll be worse than I can stand. But I'd rather not stand it here than not stand it on a stage to nowhere." He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was burning low, and the light kept jumping, and her face in that light was set in a way he hadn't seen on her face before. A set that wasn't anger, wasn't pride, but something older and harder underneath both. It was the look of a person who had already decided what she was willing to lose and had decided she wasn't going to lose it. "All right," he said. "All right." He stood up and carried his bowl to the sink. He turned at the door of his room. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll teach you to shoot." She nodded. He closed the door behind him. It rained for 2 days. Cold rain, not snow, the warm front from the south breaking the last of the powder into mud and rivulets. The creek behind the cabin doubled, then tripled, the brown water shouldering down the stones with a steady low rush that you could hear from the porch. Silas taught her in the back clearing where the trees gave them cover. He set up empty tins on a fallen log 30 yards out and put the rifle in her hands and walked her through it without saying much more than was necessary. "Stock against your shoulder, not the bone, the meat. Higher, there, cheek to the wood. Both eyes open until you're sighting, then close the off one. Breathe out, squeeze, don't pull. The trigger doesn't owe you anything. You ask it for what you want." The first shot kicked harder than she expected, and she stumbled half a step back. The tin sat untouched on the log. "Again," he said. She missed 5 more times before she clipped a tin. By the end of the morning, she'd hit 2 of them dead on and was loading the rifle herself without fumbling. Her shoulder was going to be black and blue, but her hands had stopped shaking, and Silas, watching from a few feet behind her, had said good exactly once. Flat, without flourish. And that single word had landed in her chest harder than the recoil. They went back to the cabin and ate. They worked through the afternoon. He patched the section of the barn roof that had caved in under the snow. She made soap from Sarah Mercer's recipe, rendering fat in the back of the cook stove until the cabin smelled like a slaughterhouse and they had to open the door despite the cold. That evening, after supper, she was at the sink washing dishes when he came up behind her. He didn't crowd her. He just stood a foot off, not quite touching. "I'm going to do something stupid," he said. She turned with a wet bowl in her hands. "What?" "I'm going to tell you what happened 5 years ago, with the man I beat." She set the bowl down carefully. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't. That's the point. I want to." He took a step back and leaned against the table behind him. He crossed his arms. He looked at the floor, and then at the wall, and then at her. "His name was Eli Halstead," Silas said. "He worked for Harlan Grayson, did jobs Harlan didn't want his sons doing. There was a girl in town named Mary Vance. She was 16. Her mother washed laundry for the boarding house. Eli Halstead hurt her bad. Her mother went to the sheriff, and the sheriff went to Harlan, and Harlan said his boy didn't do it, and that was the end of it. The sheriff dropped the matter. Mary Vance never came out of that house again. She was dead by the end of the year. Not from what Eli did exactly, but from what came after." Evelyn didn't move. "I knew Mary," Silas said. "Not well, but she was a good kid. She used to bring my mother bread before my mother died, when nobody else in town would come up the road. I owed her family something, so I went looking for Eli Halstead, and I found him drunk behind the saloon, and I did what the sheriff wouldn't do." He stopped. He uncrossed his arms. He pressed the heels of his hands against the edge of the table. "I didn't mean to nearly kill him. I meant to break some part of him that wouldn't grow back. I broke his arm and 3 of his ribs and most of his face. The doctor saved his life, and I'm not sorry for the broken parts, but I'm sorry I lost control. There's a difference, Evelyn. A man who hurts someone on purpose is one thing. A man who can't tell when to stop is another. I've never been sure which one I am." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight ran across his scar. He wasn't meeting her eyes. "Eli Halstead is the man with one arm in Black Hollow now," she said quietly. "He is. And Harlan never forgave you." "Harlan never had to forgive me, because in his head I'm the one who needs forgiving. As far as he's concerned, Eli was his man and I broke his man, and that's the offense. Mary Vance doesn't enter into it. Nobody talks about her anymore. Her mother left town 6 months after she died, and nobody asked where she went." Evelyn was quiet. She dried her hands on her apron, slowly, the way you do when you're giving yourself time to think. "You did the right thing," she said. "I did a thing. I'm not sure what kind of thing it was." "Silas, you did the right thing." She looked up at him. "Maybe not in the right way. Maybe not in the way a court would call right. But you did it because someone had to, and nobody else would. That counts. It counts for something, even if it cost you everything afterward." He didn't answer. He stared at the table. "It cost me everything afterward," he said finally. "I know." He nodded once, slow. He pushed off the table. He went to the door and stood with his hand on the latch, not opening it, just standing there. "I won't lose control again," he said. "Not for you, not for any of this. I want you to know that. Whatever Harlan does, I'll meet it like a man, not like that night." "I never thought you would." He turned his head and looked at her. There was something terrible in his face. Not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of raw, uncovered exhaustion she'd only ever seen once before, in a mirror, on the morning after she'd realized Marcus Leary had taken everything. "You should have," he said. He opened the door and went out into the rain. She stood at the sink for a long time, listening to him walk the perimeter of the cabin the way he sometimes did when something inside him needed working out. She didn't follow him. She didn't call after him. She finished the dishes. She set the kettle on for fresh coffee. She built up the fire. When he came back in 20 minutes later, his hair was wet and his coat was dark across the shoulders. She handed him a cup without saying anything. He took it. Their fingers touched briefly on the handle and neither of them pulled away. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." He sat by the fire. She picked up the mending again. The rain kept on outside. She didn't know yet that 2 miles down the trail, in the dark and the rain, 3 riders were tying their horses in the trees just off the road. She didn't know that Royce Grayson had a can of kerosene tied to his saddle. She didn't know that the warm front and the rain and the dark were the exact conditions someone would choose if they wanted to do something on Silas Mercer's land and be back at their father's house before the sun came up. She only knew that her shoulder ached, that the soap was setting in the molds on the back porch, that the cornbread for tomorrow was already mixed and resting under a damp cloth, and that across the fire from her sat a man whose hands she had stitched, whose mother's recipes she had cooked, whose boots were drying by the hearth beside her own. The lamp burned low, the fire burned steady. Outside, somewhere off in the rain, an owl called once and went quiet. The owl called again, closer this time. Evelyn didn't notice it. She'd dropped her stitching back into the basket and was watching Silas across the fire, watching the way his shoulders had finally come down from his ears, the way his hand had stopped flexing around the coffee cup. "You're tired," she said. "I'm always tired. Tired in a different way tonight." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. Maybe. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle. The wind had laid down. The fire was burning low and clean, the kind of fire that didn't need tending for a while. "You should sleep," she said. "I should." Neither of them moved. He drank his coffee. She picked up her mending again, just for something to do with her hands, but she didn't put the needle to the cloth. After a minute, she set it down again. "Silas. What you told me tonight about Mary Vance, about Eli Halstead." She paused. "Thank you for telling me." He didn't answer right away. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the floor beside his chair. "I should have told you the first night." "No, you shouldn't have. The first night I'd have been a fool to trust either of us. Tonight I'm just a woman in a kitchen who needed to know." He almost smiled. The scar pulled at his mouth. "Go to bed," she said. "I'll bank the fire." He stood up, slow, his hand against his ribs out of habit, now more than pain. He paused at the door of his room. He didn't turn around. "You shoot all right," he said. "I'm getting there." "You shoot all right, Evelyn." He closed the door behind him. She sat by the fire a while longer. The owl called a third time, somewhere out toward the back of the property. She blew out the lamp. She banked the coals and laid one half-burnt log across them so they'd hold till morning. She went to her room and didn't bother to undress, just took off her boots and lay down on the quilt with the rifle within arm's reach, the way he'd told her to keep it. She didn't expect to sleep. She slept anyway. Hard. What woke her was the horse, not Drum. Drum was a sound she knew now, the particular weight and rhythm of his step. This was a different horse. 2 different horses. 3. They were not on the trail. They were moving slow through the trees somewhere to the east of the cabin, in the brush, where horses had no business being unless someone was trying to keep them quiet. Evelyn was sitting up before she was fully awake, her hand on the rifle stock. She listened. A man's voice, low. Another voice answered it. She couldn't make out the words. The horses moved another few steps and stopped. She was at Silas's door without remembering crossing the floor. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open. He was already sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed except for his boots, pulling them on. "You heard?" she whispered. "I heard." He stood up. He took his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. He checked the load, slow and methodical, every movement quiet. "How many?" he said. 3 horses, east side. Maybe 60 yards out, moving slow." "You're certain it's 3? "I'm certain." He nodded once. He looked at her standing in his doorway with her hair down and the rifle in her hands and her face very pale, and his jaw tightened. "I want you in the root cellar," he said. "No." "Evelyn? No. I'm not crouching in a hole while you go out and get shot in the back. I can hit a tin at 30 yards now. You said so yourself. I'm not useless, and I'm not going to hide." He looked at her for 1 beat, 2, 3. Then he nodded again, harder this time. "Stay in the cabin. Don't come out unless I call for you. There's a slit in the shutter over the kitchen window. You watch the back of the cabin from there. I'll take the front. If you see anyone coming around the side, you put a round through that shutter and you don't ask questions. You understand me?" "I understand." "If they get inside, if it goes that bad, you go out the bedroom window and you run, not to town, up the slope. There's a rocky cut about 200 yards above the cabin. You hide there and you don't come down until daylight." "Silas, I'm not going to—" You promise me, Evelyn." She looked at him. His face in the dark was a hard set of edges and pale eyes. "I promise." He pushed past her into the main room. He moved without a sound. He blew out the last ember of the lamp wick that was still glowing. He took up a position against the wall beside the front door, where he could see out the small gap in the shutter without being seen. Evelyn went to the kitchen window. She slid the wooden bar of the shutter half open, just enough to see, and put her eye to the gap. The clearing was dark. The drizzle had stopped. A thin moon broke through ragged cloud, washing the snow and mud yard in a pale, watery light. Nothing moved. Then something did. A shape detached from the line of pines on the east side of the cabin and crossed maybe 10 feet into the open before stopping. A second shape followed. The third stayed back in the trees with the horses. The two in the open were carrying something between them. It took her a second to understand what she was looking at. A can. A long can, the kind that held kerosene, and a bundle that looked like rags. Her stomach turned. They weren't here to shoot. They were here to burn. They were going to set the barn on fire, or the cabin. They were going to do it and ride away and let the dark and the rain cover their tracks. And in the morning, Harlan Grayson would tell anyone who asked that Silas Mercer had been careless with a lamp, and Eli Halstead's voice would carry into every conversation in Black Hollow. And that would be the end of it. Her hand on the rifle was shaking. She made it stop. The two figures came another 10 feet into the clearing. She could see them better now. The larger one, broad-shouldered, walking with the heavy roll she remembered from the saddle, was Royce Grayson. The smaller one beside him was shorter and slighter and moved in a way that wasn't sure of itself. She watched the smaller one for half a breath and understood it was the youngest, Caleb, the boy who hadn't looked at her on his father's horse. Royce gestured toward the barn. The boy didn't move. Royce gestured again, harder. "Silas," Evelyn whispered, just loud enough to carry across the room. "Barn. They've got kerosene." "How many in the open?" "Two. Royce and the youngest. There's one more back in the trees with the horses." "You sure on the youngest?" "It's him." Silas didn't answer for a long second. Then he said quietly, "Don't fire unless they fire first. You understand me? Not unless they fire first or they get to the cabin. You hear me, Evelyn?" "I hear you." She watched. Royce was halfway to the barn now, the kerosene can in one hand. The boy followed at a distance, the bundle of rags clutched against his chest. Even from 60 feet, Evelyn could see he was scared. His head kept turning toward the cabin. He kept stopping. Royce kept whispering at him to hurry. The cabin door eased open. Evelyn's breath caught. Silas stepped onto the porch. He didn't shout. He didn't level the rifle. He held it across his body with the muzzle low, and he stood in the open doorway with the lamplight that wasn't there behind him, just a black shape on a black porch, and he said, "Royce." Royce Grayson froze in the middle of the clearing. The kerosene can clanked once against his leg. The boy beside him dropped the rags. "That you, Mercer?" Royce called back. His voice was loud, too loud, the voice of a man trying to cover something with volume. "You know it's me. Bit late to be out for a walk. Bit late for you to be on my land." Royce laughed. It was a thin, brittle laugh. "We got turned around in the dark, lost the road, with a can of kerosene. Lamp oil for the bunkhouse. We were headed home." "From which direction?" A beat. Royce shifted the can to his other hand. "Mercer, you put that rifle down, and we'll talk about it like neighbors. I'm not pointing it at you. You set that can down on the ground, you and the boy walk back to your horses, and you ride out, and we don't have to do this tonight." "Or what?" "Or we do it tonight." Evelyn could hear her own pulse in her ears. She kept her eye to the gap in the shutter. She kept the rifle ready. The third man in the trees, she still couldn't see him properly, just a darker shape among the trunks, hadn't moved. Royce took half a step backward, just half. But the boy beside him took a full step, and another, and dropped the rags in the snow. "Royce," the boy said. His voice cracked. "Royce, come on." "Shut up, Caleb." "Royce, this ain't what Pa said." "I said shut up." "He said scare him. He didn't say—" "Caleb, shut up." The boy didn't shut up. He turned and ran. Not back toward the trees and the horses. He ran sideways across the clearing, away from his brother and away from the cabin both, like a deer that doesn't know which direction is safe. He tripped on the broken section of the split-rail fence and went down hard and scrambled up again and kept going. Royce swore. He set the kerosene can down. He reached for his hip. "Royce, don't," Silas said. Royce pulled the gun. What happened next happened in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Royce's pistol came up. Silas's rifle came up faster. The third man in the trees shouted something. Evelyn, without thinking, without deciding, with her hands moving before her mind caught up, put the muzzle of her rifle through the slit in the shutter and pulled the trigger. She didn't aim for Royce. She aimed for the kerosene can on the ground beside him. The can blew. Not like in a stage play, not a fireball, just a hard cough of vapor that knocked Royce sideways and sprayed kerosene across his coat and the snow. The pistol in his hand went off into the dirt. Silas was already off the porch, moving across the clearing at a run, and he reached Royce before Royce could get the gun up again, and he put the butt of his rifle into the side of Royce Grayson's head once, hard, and Royce went down. The third man in the trees shouted again. Hoofbeats. 2 horses, maybe 3, breaking out the east side of the clearing at a panicked gallop, branches snapping. Silas stood over Royce. His chest was heaving. He had the rifle in both hands. He looked down at the man on the ground, kerosene-soaked, blood running from his temple into the snow. He didn't hit him again. Evelyn was already coming out the cabin door, her rifle still in her hand, her shawl forgotten on the chair. "Don't," she said, even though he hadn't done anything yet. "I'm not. I know you're not. I'm just saying it out loud." He looked at her across the clearing. His face was wet. She didn't think it was rain. "You shot the can," he said. "I did. That was a good shot. I aimed for the can on purpose." "I know you did." He looked down at Royce again. The man was breathing. He wasn't getting up. "The boy," Evelyn said. "Caleb. He ran." "Yeah. He didn't want to be here." "No, he didn't." Silas crouched down beside Royce. He pulled the pistol away from where it had fallen and tucked it into his own belt. He patted the man down quickly. A knife from one boot, a small leather sap from a coat pocket, and tossed those onto the snow. He looked up at Evelyn. "I'm going to put him in the barn till morning, tied. Then I'm going down to town with him at first light." "To the sheriff?" "To the sheriff. He won't do anything." "He won't. But it'll be on the record that I brought him in alive and tied, and a lot of folks will see it, and that matters more than the sheriff." He stood up. He winced. The wound in his side had opened. There was a dark patch spreading across his shirt. "Silas, your stitches." "I know. Let me help you with him." Between them, they got Royce Grayson upright and walking. He came to enough to curse them both and try to spit, and Silas hit him once, open-handed, across the face. Not hard, just enough to settle him. And after that, Royce walked. They got him into the barn, and Silas tied him to one of the support posts with rope from the tack wall, ankles and wrists both, and they checked the knots twice. The kerosene can lay split open in the snow outside. The rags lay in a clump beside it. Evelyn collected the rags by the corner of one with her boot and dragged them back toward the cabin so the wind wouldn't catch them and blow them somewhere they could burn. Inside the cabin, she lit the lamp. Silas sat at the table and let her unbutton his shirt and check the wound. The stitches she'd put in had held except for 2 on the lowest end of the cut. He'd torn those when he swung the rifle butt. "You're going to need new stitches in the morning," she said. "Right now I'm just going to bandage it tight." "Fine." She bandaged it tight. Her hands were steady. They shouldn't have been. They were. When she was done, she sat down across from him at the table. The lamp was between them. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the first morning, on the porch with the wind in the pines, like he was measuring her. But the measurement was different now, and they both knew it. "You said you wouldn't lose control," she said. "I didn't." "No, you didn't." He let out a long breath. He scrubbed a hand across his face. "It was close, Evelyn. When he pulled that pistol, when I thought he might—" He stopped. He looked at his hand on the table. "I know," she said. "It was close." "You stopped. That's the part that matters. You stopped." He nodded slowly. He didn't look up. She got up and put water on. She brought him a cup of coffee. She brought one for herself. They sat across from each other in the lamplight, and the rain started again outside. Light, almost a mist. And somewhere out there in the dark, Caleb Grayson was running through the woods on foot, And somewhere else, the third man was riding home to tell Harlan what had happened, and tomorrow Black Hollow was going to wake up to news that would split the town one way or another. None of it could be undone now. "You said the road would be gone once the snow set in," Evelyn said. "I did." "How long until that?" 2 weeks, maybe. 3 if the weather holds warm. Once it goes, it goes. And after that, nobody's coming up this mountain from below." "Nobody." "Good." He looked at her. "Don't misunderstand me," she said. "I'm not afraid of Harlan Grayson, but I'd just as soon spend the winter not watching the tree line every time the wind moves." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Fair." They drank their coffee. The lamp burned down. The fire was almost out, and Silas got up and built it back, slow, his hand on his ribs. He stayed crouched in front of the hearth for longer than he needed to. When he stood up, he didn't go back to the table. He stood in front of the fire with his back to her. "My mother used to say something," he said, "when I was small. She used to say that some people walk into your life and they're just passing through, and some people walk in and they take their boots off." Evelyn didn't move. "I never understood what she meant when I was a boy," he said. "I think I understand it now." She set her cup down on the table very carefully so she wouldn't spill it. "Silas, I'm not asking anything from you," he said. He still hadn't turned around. "I just wanted you to know it, in case something happens tomorrow, in case it goes another way. I wanted you to know." She got up and crossed the room. She came up behind him at the fire. She didn't touch him. She just stood there, close enough that he would feel her there. "Nothing's going to happen tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow you're going to ride down with Royce, tied across his own horse, and you're going to drop him on the sheriff's porch, and you're going to come back. And I'm going to be on this porch when you do, with coffee. The way I was the last time, the way I'll be every time." He turned. He looked down at her in the firelight. She reached up, slow, deliberate, giving him every chance to step away, and put her hand against the scarred side of his face. His skin was warm. The scar was rough under her palm. He closed his eyes. "You took your boots off the first day," she said. "I know I did." "All right then." He opened his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't kiss her. He just put his hand over hers where it rested against his cheek and held it there for a few seconds. Then he let her go. "You should sleep," he said. "I won't sleep." "Try." She tried. She lay in her bed in her clothes with the rifle still on the table beside her, and she didn't sleep. She heard him moving around in the main room, heard him at the window every few minutes, checking the clearing, heard him sit down by the fire, then get up, then sit down again. Sometime before dawn, she heard him at her door. He didn't open it. He stood outside for a long moment. Then he went back to his chair. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. By the time the sky outside her window had gone from black to gray, the rain had stopped entirely, and the cold had come back hard. She got up, washed her face in the basin, twisted her hair into a knot at the back of her neck, and went out into the main room. Silas was already in his coat. He'd thrown a heavy oilcloth across his saddle. Drum was at the rail. "Tea's on the stove," he said. "I'll be back by dark. Be careful." "I will." He looked at her once across the room. Then he went out. She watched from the porch as he led Royce Grayson out of the barn, Royce upright, hands tied in front of him, a long lead from his wrist to Silas's saddle horn. Royce wasn't fighting. He had a black eye and a swollen jaw from the night before, and dried kerosene crusted on his coat, and he looked like a man who had finally understood that the world had narrower edges than he'd thought. Silas swung up into the saddle. He didn't look back. He led horse and prisoner down the trail and into the trees. She stayed on the porch a long time after they were gone. The clearing was very still. The split kerosene can was where she'd left it. The rags were against the cabin wall. A magpie landed on the corner of the woodpile and watched her with its bright, intelligent eye. She went inside. She fed the fire. She put on more water. She started bread for the evening. Around mid-morning, she was at the table chopping onions when the sound of a horse on the trail brought her up sharp. She picked up the rifle. She went to the kitchen window and put her eye to the slit. It wasn't Silas. It was a single rider on a small bay horse, coming up the trail slow. As the rider got closer, she saw it was a boy, skinny, hatless, a bruise across one cheek, Caleb Grayson. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He didn't ride in. He sat his horse and looked at the cabin with the look of a person who knew he wasn't welcome and had come anyway. Evelyn set the rifle against the wall by the door. She didn't lean it. She just set it there. Then she opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. "Caleb," she said. He flinched at his own name in her mouth. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a boy's voice, not a man's. "I came to..." "To what?" "I came to say I'm sorry." She crossed her arms. The cold went straight through her shawl. "You ran last night." "Yes, ma'am." "You ran before anything bad happened. Why?" His face crumpled just for a second before he got it back. "Because I didn't want to do it. I told Royce I didn't want to. He said Pa would beat me bloody if I didn't come. I came. But when we got out there and he started, I couldn't. You couldn't burn down our barn." "No, ma'am." "With us inside it, maybe." He said it'd just be the barn. He swore. Said you'd get out fine. Said it was just a scare. But once we were out there and he was pouring out the can, I knew he wasn't going to stop with the barn. I knew. She looked at him for a long moment. He was 16. His hands on the reins were chapped from the cold. His coat was too big for him. One of Royce's, probably, handed down. He didn't look like Harlan Grayson. He looked like someone who lived in Harlan Grayson's house. "Where's your father?" she said. "At home. He doesn't know I'm here. He thinks I rode out to count the cattle." He swallowed. "Ma'am, my brother, is he..." "He's alive. Silas took him to the sheriff this morning." The boy let out a breath that was half relief, half something else. He nodded slowly. "Pa's going to know by tonight," he said. "Once Silas drops Royce off, he's going to know everything, and he's going to..." He stopped. He swallowed again. "He's going to come." I figured. "Ma'am, I came to tell you. I came to warn you. He's going to come with everyone he's got." She looked past him at the trail, at the gray light through the pines, at the road that wound down to town, and a town that would soon be talking about all of this in voices low and high. Then she looked back at the boy. "Caleb," she said, "get down off that horse. Come inside. I'll give you coffee." He stared at her. "Ma'am?" "Get down." He got down. He came up the porch step like every step might fall through. She held the door for him. He went inside. She closed the door behind them both and barred it. And the cabin held warm and quiet around them, and the fire popped once in the hearth like it was answering something neither of them had said out loud. Caleb Grayson sat at the table the way a stray dog sits when it isn't sure whether you mean to feed it or kick it. He held the coffee cup in both hands and didn't drink. Evelyn sat across from him and let him take his time. She'd learned in St. Louis that a boy who's about to say something hard will not say it if you push, and Caleb had ridden 10 miles in the cold to come tell her something he was clearly terrified of. "How many men does your father have?" she said finally. "Working for him?" 8. Maybe 9 if you count Eli, but Eli only has the one arm and he mostly tends the books. Caleb looked into his cup. "But it won't be all of them. Some of them won't come. Mr. Tilden won't. He's the foreman, and he's been with us since before I was born, and he told my father once, right to his face, that he wouldn't ride against a man who hadn't drawn first. Pa was mad about it for a week. He didn't fire him because he can't run the ranch without Tilden, and he knows it. So how many? 4, maybe 5. Royce and his crowd. But Royce is..." He flushed. "Royce isn't coming, so 4. Maybe Pa himself. He's old, but he's mean." "And the sheriff?" Caleb shook his head. "Sheriff Halloran does what Pa tells him. He won't ride against Silas, but he won't ride for him either. He'll find a reason to be somewhere else. He always does." Evelyn nodded slowly. She got up and went to the stove and refilled her own cup, just to give her hands something to do. The boy across her table was 16 years old, and he was sitting in his enemy's kitchen telling her how many men his father was going to send to kill the man who'd taken her in. He'd ridden through cold rain to do it. He had a bruise on his face from yesterday, and another, older one, peeking out above his collar. "How long has he hit you?" she said, not turning around. There was a long silence behind her. "Since I was 9, ma'am. Since my mother died." "And Royce?" "Royce hits me too." She turned around. The boy was looking at the table, his mouth set in the particular way young men set their mouths when they've decided they will not cry in front of a stranger. "Caleb," she said, "you can't go home." He looked up. "You can't," she said. "You ride back into that house tonight and tell your father what you did. He'll kill you. You ride back and don't tell him. He'll figure it out anyway. Royce will tell him just to save his own neck. So you can't go home." "Ma'am, I don't have anywhere else." "You have here. For tonight. Tomorrow we'll think about the rest." He stared at her like she'd handed him something heavy he didn't know how to carry. He didn't argue. He nodded once and went back to looking at his cup. She put the boy in her room. She wasn't going to be sleeping in it anyway, not tonight. She gave him the quilt and a clean shirt of Silas's that hung on him like a sack. She told him to bar the door from inside and not to open it for anyone but her or Silas. He did. The latch clicked over and she stood on the other side of it and pressed her hand flat against the wood for a second and then turned away. She put Caleb's horse in the barn beside Drum's empty stall. She forked hay into the manger and broke the ice on the water bucket with the heel of her boot. The split kerosene can was still in the snow outside. She picked it up and carried it around to the back of the cabin and shoved it into the snowbank where it would freeze in and stay put till spring. Then she sat on the porch and waited. Silas came back 2 hours before sunset. He came on Drum, alone, riding slow. He had a long bruise across the back of one hand, and his eyes were so tired they were almost not eyes anymore, just two sockets where his eyes had been. He pulled up at the rail and slid down and didn't speak until he was on the porch. "Sheriff took him," he said, "locked him in the back room, said he'd send word to Harlan." "And the town?" "The town saw." She nodded. She'd known it would be that simple in some ways and that complicated in others. She held the door open for him. He went in. He stopped in the middle of the main room. He looked at the bowl with the half-cut onions still on the table. He looked at the rifle leaning by the door. He looked at the closed door of her bedroom. "There's a horse in the barn I don't recognize," he said. "Caleb Grayson." He turned and looked at her hard. "He came up alone this morning," she said. "He came to warn us. His father's going to come here as soon as he hears Royce got dropped at the sheriff's. Caleb says 4 men, maybe 5, maybe Harlan himself. The sheriff won't help and won't get in the way. Caleb couldn't go home, so I put him in my room, and I figured we'd worry about the rest later." Silas didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he walked over to the rifle, picked it up, checked it, set it down again. "You put a Grayson in our cabin," he said. "I put a 16-year-old boy in our cabin." He looked at her. Then his mouth did something that was almost a smile, the most tired smile she'd ever seen on him. "All right, all right, all right." He sat down at the table. "How many shells do we have for that rifle?" 18. I counted. 18's plenty. "Silas, 18 for an entire fight is not plenty." "It will be." He leaned back. His eyes closed for a second and then opened again. "Harlan's not going to come tonight, Evelyn. He's going to want the whole town to see him do it, or he's going to want the whole town to never know he did it. Either way, that means he waits till he can plan it. 2 days at the earliest, maybe a week. You can't know that." "I know Harlan." She sat down across from him. "And in 2 days, or a week," she said, "what then?" "Then we settle it." "How?" "I don't know yet." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her, maybe ever, and she heard the cost of it in his voice. He didn't know. He'd lived in these mountains alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to plan around another person, and now he was planning around 2 of them, and the math hadn't come together in his head yet. She put her hand on his where it rested on the table. He didn't move it. "All right," she said. "Then we'll figure it out together." The wind came in hard that night, the warm front gone for good, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. By midnight, the rain that had soaked the trail had frozen into a sheet of pebbled ice. By morning, the temperature had not climbed. The mountains had decided winter, and winter had come. It didn't snow. Not yet. But the cold was the kind that meant snow was coming, and a lot of it, and soon. They woke Caleb and made him eat. The boy was quiet at the table, eyes darting at Silas, then at his plate, then at Silas again. Silas didn't speak to him at first. He drank his coffee, he cut his bread, he chewed slow. Then, halfway through the meal, without looking at the boy, he said, "You shoot?" Caleb looked up. "Yes, sir." "How well?" "My pa taught me on rabbits. I'm not bad." "All right then. After breakfast you come out with me and we'll see how not bad you are." Caleb stared. He looked at Evelyn. She nodded once. He went back to his eggs. Outside in the cold, Silas set tins on the same fallen log he'd used to teach Evelyn. He handed his own rifle to Caleb and watched him shoot. The boy was telling the truth. He wasn't bad. He missed his first 2 and hit the next 4. His hands were steady. His eye was good. "All right," Silas said. "If anybody comes up that trail who isn't me or her or someone we know, you don't ask their business. You shoot to wound first. You shoot to kill if they shoot back. You understand?" "Yes, sir." "You ever shoot a man, Caleb?" "No, sir." "It's not like a rabbit." "No, sir." "It's something you don't get back. Once you've done it, it's done. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." Silas studied him. "I'm not asking you to do it. I'm telling you what to do if you have to. There's a difference." "Yes, sir." "All right." They went back inside. The day passed slow. Evelyn baked. Silas worked on the loose hinges of the shutters, reinforcing the wood with strips of leather and new nails. Caleb helped him, holding boards steady, fetching nails. Silas barely spoke to the boy, but he didn't push him away either. By mid-afternoon, the 2 of them were working in something like rhythm, the boy anticipating what Silas would need next and getting it before being asked. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window for a moment. She watched the way Silas reached out and adjusted Caleb's grip on a board without saying a word, and the way Caleb looked at him after with a quick startled gratitude that the boy himself probably didn't recognize. And she thought, this is what it would have been. If his father had been a different kind of father. If anyone had ever shown him how a grown man's hands were supposed to move around a young one. She turned away from the window and rolled out more dough than she needed. Harlan Grayson did not come that day. He did not come the next. On the 3rd morning, the snow began. It came down soft at first, then hard, then in great rolling sheets that buried the woodpile to the 2nd log and turned the clearing into one long white slope from cabin to tree line. Silas went out to check on Drum and came back covered to the chest. The trail down to Black Hollow, he reported, was already gone in places. Drifted over, swept smooth. "He's not coming up that," Silas said. "Not now. Not till spring." "And then?" "And then I'm going down to meet him before he comes up." The snow held for 2 days. When it cleared, the world outside the cabin was completely transformed. Every fence post wearing a tall white cap, the barn roof a smooth slope of unbroken white, the pines bent low with their burdens. The cold was a presence now, a thing in the air with its own weight. Caleb stayed. Nobody discussed it. He helped haul water from the creek, where they had to break through a foot of ice each morning. He helped with the chickens. He learned how Evelyn made cornbread and stood at her elbow, with his sleeves rolled up, doing what he was told. At night he slept on a pallet by the fire and woke before either of them most mornings. On the 5th night of the snow, with the wind moaning in the chimney and the temperature outside somewhere below 0, Evelyn was sitting at the table sewing a tear in one of Caleb's shirts. He'd torn it on a nail in the barn. When the boy looked up from where he was sitting on the floor by the fire and said, "Ma'am, why are you being kind to me?" She set the needle down. "Because someone needed to. I came up here with my brother to burn your barn down. You came up here a 2nd time to warn me. Both things happened. I get to pick which one matters." He thought about that. "My father would say the first one matters," he said. "Your father isn't here." Silas, in his chair by the fire, didn't look up from the bridle he was working on, but he said, quiet and without heat, "Your father's been wrong about most things his whole life, Caleb. You don't have to be wrong about the same things." The boy looked at his hands. They were red and chapped from the cold and the work. He didn't say anything for a while. "I don't want to go back," he said finally. "You don't have to," Evelyn said. "He'll come for me. Then he'll come for you. We'll deal with him when he comes." The boy nodded slowly. He didn't cry. He just sat with that for a long minute, and then he got up and put another log on the fire and sat back down, and the room was quiet again, except for the wind and the sound of leather under Silas's hands. Spring came late that year. The snow didn't break in earnest until almost the middle of April. The creek behind the cabin ran high and brown for 2 weeks straight, and the trail to Black Hollow was a slough of mud well into May. They knew this even without going down to look at it, because Harlan Grayson did not come up. The winter had given Silas time to think. It had given Evelyn time too. They had talked over the long evenings by the fire, really talked, in a way they hadn't before, about what came next. About whether Silas would go down to confront Harlan and end it, or whether they would wait. About whether the law would ever be on their side. About what Caleb's life looked like from here. In the end, the snow made the decision for them. Because while Silas and Evelyn and Caleb were snowed in on the mountain, mending and cooking and shooting tins off a log to keep the boys sharp, Harlan Grayson made a different mistake. It happened in February. They didn't hear about it until May. A young man named Tom Avery, son of a small homesteader on the south end of Grayson land, got into a dispute with Harlan over a boundary. The boundary, in fact, was exactly the kind of imaginary line Harlan had once tried to draw against Silas. Avery refused to move his fence. 3 nights later, his barn burned down. 2 of his horses died inside it. This time, Harlan made the mistake of using a man who couldn't keep his mouth shut. By the time the spring thaw came, Tom Avery had 3 witnesses willing to swear to what they'd heard, including a stable hand on Harlan's own ranch, and Mr. Tilden, the foreman who'd told Harlan he wouldn't ride against an unarmed man. The town turned slow at first and then all at once. The U.S. Marshal from Ridgemont came down at the request of 3 families who had each, over the years, lost something to Harlan Grayson and never been able to prove it. The Marshal asked questions. People who would have stayed silent 6 months ago talked. Royce Grayson was still in the sheriff's back room. Sheriff Halloran had been too afraid of the town to release him without a hearing, and Royce, when the marshal got to him, sang like a man trying to save his neck. Harlan Grayson was arrested in his own front room on a Tuesday afternoon in late May. He went without a fight. He had the look, witnesses later said, of a man who had been waiting for this day for 30 years and was almost relieved to have it finally come. They heard about it in early June when a rider came up the trail with mail and news. Silas was on the porch mending a halter when the rider topped the rise. Evelyn was inside churning butter. Caleb was at the woodpile. The rider was Dale Hutchins. He'd never been up the mountain in his life. He sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing and took off his spectacles and cleaned them on his shirt, while Silas walked out to meet him. Then he put them back on and told them, slow and even, what had happened in Black Hollow over the winter and what had happened that week. Harlan's going to the territorial court in Ridgemont, Dale said. He won't walk free from this one. Tom Avery's case is solid. There's 3 other families coming forward. They'll put him away for a long time, Mercer. He's done. Silas stood in the snow-spotted yard and didn't say anything for a long time. And Royce? He said finally. Royce is going with him, for your barn and what came before it. Caleb. Dale's eyes went past Silas to the boy who'd come out from the woodpile and was standing very still by the corner of the cabin. Caleb, son, you can come down whenever you want. Nobody's looking to charge you with anything. Half the town has been wondering where you got to. Tilden's been running the ranch since your father was arrested. He says you've got a place there as long as you want it. Caleb's face did something complicated. He looked at Silas. He looked at Evelyn, who had come out onto the porch. He looked at the ground. I'll think about it, he said. Take your time, Dale said. It'll keep. Dale didn't get down off his horse. He'd done what he came to do. He turned the horse and started back down the trail, and just before he disappeared into the trees, he pulled up and looked back. Mercer, he called. Silas looked. The town wants to see you when you come down. I'm just telling you. There's folks who've changed their tune. You won't get treated the way you used to be. I can't say it'll be friendly. I can say it'll be different. All right, Silas said. Dale touched his hat and rode out. Caleb went down to Black Hollow at the end of June, on a clear day with the meadow flowers just coming up along the trail. He took his horse and a bundle Evelyn had packed for him, extra shirts, a tin of biscuits, the wool socks she'd knitted him during the winter, the second pair she'd made because the first had come out lopsided, and Caleb had said he didn't mind. He had grown 2 inches since the night Evelyn had opened the door to him. He sat his horse differently. He met your eyes when he spoke. He didn't say much when he left. He didn't have to. He hugged Evelyn, quick, hard, the way a boy hugs when he doesn't quite know how, and shook Silas's hand, and Silas held on a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and Caleb nodded once and turned the horse and went. He'll be back? Evelyn said, watching the trees swallow him. I know he will. Often, I expect. I expect so too. They stood on the porch a while. The summer came in slow and warm. The meadow above the cabin filled with wildflowers, paintbrush, lupine, columbine, the way Silas had once described it to her back in October, when neither of them had really believed they'd be standing in it together. Evelyn put in a proper garden behind the cabin, a real one, not just patched together kitchen scraps, but rows of beans and onions and squash and carrots. With a fence around it, she and Silas built together over 3 afternoons. In late July, the pastor came up. His name was Reverend Hollings, a thin man with kind eyes and a habit of looking at the ground when he spoke. He'd been the pastor in Black Hollow for less than a year. He hadn't been there during the bad years. He had no opinion about the man Silas Mercer used to be, only the man he was now, which was the man who had spent the previous winter sheltering a Grayson boy from his own father and not asking anything from anyone for it. He sat at their kitchen table and drank coffee and watched Evelyn move around the cabin and watched Silas hand her a cloth when she needed it without her asking. And after a while, he set down his cup and said, "It's not my place to ask, but it's also not anybody else's place. So I'll ask. Are the two of you intending to be married?" Silas looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Silas. "We are," Silas said. It was the first time either of them had said it out loud. They hadn't even said it to each other. But neither of them was surprised by it, and neither of them looked away. "Then I think you ought to be," Reverend Hollings said simply. "When would you like to do it?" They did it in August. They did it small. They did it on the high meadow above the cabin, where the wildflowers came up to your knees and the wind moved through them like a slow hand. There were 11 people there. Caleb came up from town. Dale Hutchins came, in his spectacles and a clean shirt. Martha Kinney came, which surprised everyone, including Martha. Mr. Tilden came, with a quiet, weathered woman who turned out to be his wife. A few of the families Silas had once kept his distance from came too, people who had once crossed the street to avoid him, and who now stood in his meadow with their hats in their hands. Evelyn wore a dress she'd made herself, from cloth Caleb had brought up on his last visit. It was the color of a sky just before sunrise, pale, almost gray, almost blue. Her hair was down. She had no veil and no flowers in her hands because she figured if she wanted flowers, she could just look around and there were enough. The ceremony was short. Reverend Hollings said the words. Silas said his part. Evelyn said hers. When it came time, Silas put a thin silver band on her finger, his mother's, kept all these years in the bottom of the bureau in the room that had been Sarah Mercer's and was now nothing of the kind. And Evelyn looked at the ring and looked up at him and didn't say anything, but her face said everything that needed saying. There was food after, set out on long planks balanced on sawhorses. Martha had brought a pie. Mr. Tilden had brought a smoked ham. Dale had brought sugar, real white sugar, a luxury, and a sack of coffee beans that he set down with a small ceremonial nod, the only joke he made all day. Evelyn caught Caleb watching her at one point during the meal. He was eating apple pie. He had a smear of it on his chin. He smiled at her in a way he hadn't smiled at anyone, maybe ever in his life, and she smiled back. And that was when she knew that whatever else this day was, it was also the day a boy without a family had decided, quietly, to claim one anyway. They didn't dance. Nobody had thought to bring a fiddle. Instead, the wind in the meadow did the music. And the people in their best clothes stood around in small knots and talked the way people do when they've spent too many years not talking and the sun moved across the sky. By evening, everyone had gone back down the trail. The cabin was quiet again. The plates were stacked. The sun was setting behind the western ridge in long red bars. Silas and Evelyn sat on the porch. There was coffee. There was the slow voice of the creek behind the cabin. There was nothing else. "I want to say something," she said. "All right. When I came up this trail with my carpetbag, I thought I'd lost everything that was ever going to belong to me. My mother, my savings, the future I'd spent 5 years saving for. I thought my life was just going to be running until I couldn't run anymore." She paused. "I was wrong about almost all of it. The future I'd saved for wasn't a future. It was a story a stranger told me, and I believed it because I needed to. The future I have is the one I made by walking up here and asking for a roof. That's different." He didn't say anything. He was looking out at the clearing. "I think people get told a lie about losing things," she said. "I think we're told that once you lose enough, you're finished, that you don't get to start again, that what's gone is gone. And it is. The things that are gone are gone. My mother isn't coming back. The $240 aren't coming back. The 5 years I spent saving them aren't coming back. She looked at him. But the truth nobody tells you is that when you lose enough, you also get something. You get the empty space where the lie used to be. And in that space, if you're brave enough and tired enough and stubborn enough, you can build something real, something that isn't promised by anyone, something that's yours because you made it. He nodded slowly. That's what this is, she said. It isn't a fairy tale. You're not a prince, and I'm not a princess, and Black Hollow isn't going to throw us a parade. You still don't talk much. I still burn the cornbread sometimes. The roof is going to leak again next spring, and we're going to have to patch it again. But it's ours. We made it. And I would rather have this small, real thing than anything anyone else has ever promised me. He reached out and took her hand. He held it between both of his. My mother used to say, he started, and then he stopped. He laughed once, low. I keep quoting her like I knew her well. I didn't. I was a boy. She died young. But she used to say there's two kinds of houses, the kind you live in because you've got nowhere else, and the kind you come home to. She wanted this one to be the second kind. My father never made it that. I never made it that either. I made it a place I lived in. He looked at her. You made it the other thing. You did that, not me. We did it. You did it. I just stopped fighting it. She laughed. That's fair, she said. The sun was almost gone. The creek murmured. Somewhere off in the pines, a small owl began its evening call, the same owl probably as the one that had called the night Royce Grayson came with his kerosene can. It wasn't a frightening sound anymore. It was just the sound a place makes when it's settling down for the night. Silas brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles. He didn't make a speech about it. He just did it, and put their hands down again on the arm of the chair between them, and they sat that way for a long time as the light went out of the sky and the first stars came up over the eastern ridge. If you'd told Evelyn Hart a year ago, standing in the dust of Black Hollow's main street with 11 cents in the lining of her bag, and the entire town watching her the way you watch a stray cat, that she would end up on a porch in the high country with a silver ring on her finger and a man like Silas Mercer holding her hand, she would have laughed. She would have walked away. She would have thought you were cruel. But here was the thing she had learned, and the thing she would carry with her for the rest of her life. People do not survive by being lucky. They survive by walking forward when there is no reason to walk forward, by knocking on doors that everyone has warned them about, by trading what little they have for the chance of something real. The world is full of press suits and good smiles and stories about Wyoming ranchers, and the world is also full of scarred men in falling down cabins who turn out to be the safest place a woman has ever stood. You don't always know which is which, you just have to be willing to find out. She had been willing. He had been willing. The boy by the woodpile had been willing. And the small, hard-won thing they had built, this cabin, this meadow, this porch, this quiet, was the proof of it. The owl called again. Silas refilled her cup from the pot at his feet. The fire inside was burning low, the way it always did at this hour, the way it would tomorrow and the day after that and every day for as long as either of them was here to tend it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Welcome home," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The wilderness around them was still wild. The winters would still be hard. There would be other Harlan Graysons in the years ahead, other lies, other men with pressed suits, because the world keeps making them, and there is no road that's ever fully safe. But for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them was alone for it. The lamp burned in the window. The porch held them. Beyond the meadow, the mountains went dark against a sky that was just starting to fill with stars, and somewhere down the trail, in a small lit-up town that would never be the same, the people of Black Hollow were eating their suppers and turning down their lamps and talking, here and there, about the wedding they had attended that morning, about a woman nobody had wanted and a man everyone had feared, and how the two of them, against every odds anyone had given, had walked out of a meadow into a life.